welcome again. Today we have very dear friend Cory. He's American, and today we come with a very different topic. It's about U.S. presidential election because, as you all know, that in Pakistan, especially in CSS, there are so many questions about U.S. history and U.S. presidential election. So today we just go through the basic about the election system in U.S. So how are you, Cory?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks for having me for this interview. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. So, Cory, just think about that. We don't know anything about U.S. election system, but U.S. is a big power, and like, of course, U.S. politics concerned with every other countries, and who's gonna become president is also concerned with our foreign policy and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you tell us like what are the basic process of choosing a president in US?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's quite complex because in the U.S. we are basically constantly caucusing for a new president, like all year round. As soon as a new president takes office, we're almost starting for the next 4 years, basically. Mm-hmm. But typically about a year and a half or so before the election, you'll start to have candidates who are running for the presidency, and this is the primary and the caucus period. And so you have people who declare that they're running for the presidency of the United States. They're starting to get volunteers, get funding, etc. That's about 2 years or a year and a half before the actual elections.
Wow.
And then in January to June of the election year, so in this case 2020, is when we have the primaries and the caucuses. And that is where each state will decide who they think should represent each party, so the Democrat and the Republican Party, for the presidency. And so that's the caucusing or the primaries. And so it starts in about January with the Iowa caucuses, which is where I'm from, and people vote in their local schools, their local gyms, to decide who they think should represent each party, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, for president. So it's very representative, basically. And then ideally by June or July or August, you would have the two candidates.
But I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but when they do in this primary process, as you said, in school or everywhere, they do this voting stuff. Do they go to like polling stations to do vote, or how they vote in the primary process?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think a theme that will be in this interview is that because the U.S. is 50 different states, it's different. Voting is different in every state.
Okay.
And so it's difficult to say, and there's nothing really universal, I guess, about voting in the U.S. It just depends on the state that you live in.
Okay.
So in Iowa and another state, they do this very old school type of thing called caucusing, where you go to like a school gymnasium and you basically stand in one corner of the gym, and that's the candidate that you want to vote for. And if your candidate doesn't get a certain percentage of the people who are present, then they don't qualify, and then you can leave that corner of the gym and go to another corner and caucus for another candidate and hoping that they win. So it's very diplomatic, it's very old school representative. And then there are other states that don't do caucuses. Most states don't do caucuses, they simply vote. And so then you would go to like a polling station, you go to like a school or some public building, maybe some government building, and you would vote for which candidate you think should represent, say, the Democratic Party or the Republican Party.
But let me ask you here, like you said, like they're choosing their like own candidate. It's intra-party or it's among the parties?
You can theoretically caucus for either party. I mean, that's the interesting thing, especially with the U.S., is there's a lot of undecided voters. There's a lot of people who they have no idea who they're voting for, or they're kind of leaning towards both, or occasionally you have politicians who are kind of in the middle, kind of moderate. They're kind of a little bit of conservative ideas, a little bit of liberal ideas. And so, I mean, I think, yeah, that was definitely an appeal that President Trump had in 2016, is he was definitely a right-wing conservative, but he was appealing to a lot of the people who were, for example, voting for Bernie Sanders, who were against the Hillary Clinton politics and were very so even you had left-wing people in the US voting for a right-wing candidate because that's just kind of the way the politics fell in that year. But generally people will canvass or they'll caucus for the people or they'll vote for the people that aligns with their party. That's usually how you register, as you register for a specific party, like to the Democratic Party.
That's right. But so coming back to the main question, so what are the second process after the primary process?
Yeah, so the primary process is going to take place, like I said, in January to June, typically, of the election year. And then in early November is when we have our elections. So in the US, it's the Tuesday after the second, or after the first Monday in November. So anywhere between November 2nd to November 8th is when we vote on a Tuesday. And that is for, like I said, all 50 states. And you can also vote from abroad. And this year, especially with Joe Biden, especially because of the coronavirus issue, they really increased the voting by mail.
Yeah, that's also my question. Like, how you guys do this voting by mail? Because I never seen my country or in even any other country.
Yeah, it's very different, and it's different in each state. In some states, for example, Nevada, which is where Las Vegas is. In Nevada, they send the state sends a ballot to every single registered voter in the state by mail. So you'll receive one if you're registered. You don't even have to ask for it. But then there are other states, especially in the South, where it's very hard to get a vote in, a ballot by mail. You might even have to show like a doctor's note that says you have like a disability, and therefore you can't go and vote in person. So therefore you need to vote in mail. So there's some states that they just send them to you in the mail, and then there's some states that they actively make it difficult for you to vote by mail. And a lot of times it's a form of voter suppression. A lot of times it's because, as we saw this year with the 2020 election, more people who voted Democrat, voted for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, voted by mail than voted for Trump. So it's especially with the coronavirus, not wanting to stand in line for hours and stuff. So that was something that the Democratic Party really wanted to increase this year, was voting by mail, not having to stand in line, not having to be exposed to other people. But it's very difficult because, like I said, there's 50 different states. Each state has different laws on how you vote, and if you can vote by mail, and if not, then you have to go and stand in line.
And there are no fake votes, and there are no rigging and nothing like that.
I mean, there's instances of voter fraud in the U.S., but it's very, very small. It's less than 1%. It's a very tiny percent, and there are checks and balances set up. I mean, even in 2017, Donald Trump signed, I think, a committee to check if there was any voter fraud in the 2016 election, and there was none. Even though he believed that there was voter fraud in the 2016 election, he found that there was none. And then we see now with the 2020 election, he's trying to establish that there is voter fraud, when actually there's probably more transparency than ever before with the counting. There's video cameras set up in these polling stations where they're counting the ballots. You can watch on live audio. So there is occasional voter fraud. Maybe if you hand if you have one of your relatives go turn in your ballot for you. Some states that might be allowed, some cases it's not allowed. That could be an instance of voter fraud, or forgetting to sign your ballot and they accept it, something like that. But in general, we're talking about, a small tenth of a percent, in the US in general.
Okay, good. So as you said, that there was one primary process when people come together and they just show their support to which candidate they want to be elected, and then there's secondary process in November when people actually go to vote, or they send their vote by mail. But in for example, in recent election, we learned that any candidate who wants to become a president, they need 270 electoral vote.
Mhm.
What are these electoral votes?
Yeah, so the U.S. has this thing called the Electoral College. It's not an actual college or university,
Of course,
but it's
like
so there are 538
Yeah.
electors in the
Yeah.
U.S. These are something that's just governed by each state, by the legislators in each state, and therefore you need 270 to win because that's a majority
Yeah.
of 538.
yeah,
And so each state has a certain number of electors. If you go online, you can look up like electoral college map, and you can see
Mhm.
how many electors there are in each state. There's a minimum of 3 for like the least populated states, and then there's a maximum of 55, which is in California.
Mhm.
So it's not. This is the thing that I think makes the U.S. a little bit different than other democracies, where it is a little bit unbalanced in how we vote. Some states obviously have more of a say than other states
yeah,
and how vote. But these electors, so if you win a state, if you win the popular vote in a state, you then typically take all of those electoral votes. And so each state will pick people
Mhm.
as electors
Mhm.
to vote in December.
Okay.
And
So this is the third process.
this is the third process. In December, so if you win, for example, Joe Biden won California,
Yeah.
in December, he's supposed to have 55 people go and vote for him as representing the state of California. And a lot of times you can't be in federal office
Yeah.
as an elector, but a lot of times these people are professors or doctors or people with PhDs and
Mhm.
very knowledgeable people that get appointed to be these state electors.
Mhm.
Sometimes there is some favoritism or some nepotism, but so that's how that process works. So really, the people vote in each state, and they're voting to give their vote towards an elected person that votes for the president.
And do they have role after election also, these electoral?
Not really. It's more of a noble position.
Mhm.
It's just and typically you would maybe only get selected once or maybe twice,
Okay.
depending on the state. But, so that's how the electoral college works. It's not simply just a popular vote. It's not simply who wins the most votes in the U.S. You don't necessarily become president. I heard a statistic that mathematically somebody could win as little as 23% of the popular vote,
Mhm.
but still become president
Mhm.
based on these electoral these electoral votes, because it puts more emphasis in higher populated areas. That's why California has 55 electoral votes, because California has over 40 million people,
Yeah.
whereas a state like Montana has about 500,000 people, and they have 3 votes. So there is more power in the more populated urban areas of the U.S.
Got it. I have one more question in this third step when you say that these electoral are going to vote in December. How we can be sure that these noble people gonna be vote for Joe Biden and not for Trump? There's no horse trading.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. There is a thing called a faithless elector, and a faithless elector is somebody who doesn't vote for who they're supposed to vote for.
Yeah.
You're supposed to vote for the person who won your state. So in California, Joe Biden should have 55 votes. If in December he has 54 votes from California, let's say, then that means there was one person who was a faithless elector. They voted against the way that the people have spoken. They are supposed to vote 55 votes for the Democratic Party candidates, which is Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, but they have chosen not to. This does happen. It's quite rare. In the last 150 or so years in the U.S., there have been instances, but it doesn't really decide the elections. And there are ways that you can get around this as well. You can change the person. You can. There are processes to change this, but it does happen, and there are some talks that there will be some faithless electors in this 2020 election, so we'll have to see in a few weeks if that happens.
Yeah, in December. That's interesting because it happens like every time in especially in my country, Pakistan. Yeah, the horse trading is like quite normal now. Okay, coming up to the next question. What are the midterm elections?
Yeah, so the midterm elections are just like their name kind of implies. they're halfway in between the presidential election. So
it's after 2 years.
Yeah, so we have the presidential election every 4 years in the U.S., 2020, 2016, 2024, etc. The midterm elections are then every 2 years, and these are where we vote for members of the House of Representatives and as well as our 100 senators that we have. We have 2 senators for each state.
Okay.
And so these can be...
So even from Montana and California, it's just two senators.
Yeah, that's so that's more equal. If you're voting for senators, it's more in the Senate, it's more equal than, say, the president or the representatives, because there's 538 representatives. But if you're voting for senators, the smallest state or the biggest state, they have the same representation in the Senate.
Okay.
And so that's every 2 years, and that's very important. In 2018, the midterm elections really went liberal. I think it was a backlash of Trump and the Republican Party, and it really skewed towards very liberal. We saw a lot of people in the U.S., a lot of women, people of color, minorities. A lot of people took office in 2018, and it was a really good thing. And so that is the midterm elections. We don't get nearly the amount of votes. People don't show up as much as like a presidential election. A lot of people don't even realize we have them, the midterm elections. But it can be very crucial because the power of the president lies in the Senate and the House of Representatives. If the president is a Democrat and the House and the Senate are mostly Democrat, more laws are going to get passed. If it's the opposite, it's going to be harder to pass laws. So it's very important to vote in our midterm elections.
So can we say that it's the midterm elections are actually the election of Senate?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's something that Americans, I think, don't appreciate, voting in the midterm elections, but it's arguably just as important, because you're either making the president more powerful or you're hindering his power and hindering the ability to work together, the two parties in the U.S. really to work together and get as much done for the people.
Nice. Cory, you elaborated everything very well. Just my one last question, because maybe people might lose some interest in our video. Now, what kind of party system U.S. have? Like how they participate in the election and in politics in general? Can you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, so the U.S. is a little bit different than many other countries, especially democracies, bigger democracies. We really only have 2 major parties. There are other parties. There are smaller parties such as the Libertarian Party, the Tea Party. We have very many independent parties. And you can vote for these people in local elections all the way up to the presidential election. But in general, we have 2 major parties, which is the GOP, or the Republican Party, and we have the Democratic Party.
Okay.
And so this is basically a 2-party system in the U.S., and that's what it's dominated. So everything typically is split right down the middle, one way or the other. So senators, you typically have, close to 50-50, and the representatives in the House, it's going to be about 50-50, but almost everyone is Republican and Democrat. Occasionally you'll have maybe one person who's independent. But so it's very, that makes the U.S., I think, a lot more divided, because you're either one or the other, or you're neither. You're not interested in politics at all, or you're either red or blue, Republican or Democrat, or you just don't want to talk about politics at all.
Nice. Well, you give quite very good insights about the U.S. Election system and the party system. I mean, for us, like the developing democracies, we need to learn about like how we can stop horse trading, how we can stop rigging, and like I don't think so. Like in near future, it is possible for us to do voting by mail or something like that. So. We need to learn from that. But thank you so much for your time and for this explanation, and it's quite interesting, and I really appreciate that, and we'd love to see you again. I really appreciate that, man.
Thanks for having me here. I really appreciate it. I hope everyone liked the video.
Yeah, that was Cory. He explained very well, and see you in the next video. Bye.